The dust of the Guadalupe Mountains tasted of alkali and defeat. Caleb Ryder rode into the hardscrabble yard of his ranch leading not cattle, but a prisoner. She walked behind his saddle, wrists bound by a coarse rope tethered to his horn. She was an Apache woman, her face a mask of impassive dust, her eyes black coals that held the reflection of the vast, unforgiving sky. Her dress was torn, and a long, shallow cut marred her cheekbone, dried to a dark line. Caleb's jaw was set like granite, his own grief a heavier chain than the one he'd used to secure her to the post outside the sheriff's vacant office in Pinto Springs. The sheriff was dead, the town in disarray after a raid, and Caleb had taken custody of this lone, captured raider. Justice was a threadbare concept on the frontier, and his heart was too full of ashes to care for its nuances. His daughters, Elsie, 7, and Mary, 5, spilled from the cabin's low door, their faces alight with the hope that always preceded his return. The light died when they saw his companion. They stopped short, two small, sun-bleached ghosts in faded calico. "Pa." Elsie's voice was small. "Inside, girls," Caleb said, his voice roughened by trail dust and a sorrow 2 years fresh. He dismounted, his body protesting every movement. He didn't look at the woman as he tied the rope from her bound wrists to the heavy iron ring meant for securing horses. "She's a prisoner. You don't go near her. You understand." Mary's lower lip trembled. "Is she a bad Indian?" "She's Apache," Caleb said, as if that answered everything. He'd lost his wife, Cora, to a fever, but he'd lost his younger brother to an Apache raid the year before. The categories in his heart were simple: family and not family, safe and threat. This woman, with her defiant silence, was firmly in the latter. He went inside, leaving her in the gathering twilight. Through the warped glass of the window, he saw his daughters peering out. He built a fire, boiled coffee, and set about making a meager supper of beans and salt pork. The silence in the cabin was a physical presence. It had been this way since Cora died, a silence of missing laughter, of missing song, of missing the gentle rustle of a skirt that meant comfort. He could mend fences and break horses, but he could not fill that silence. Later, as a 3/4 moon silvered the yard, he took a tin plate of food and a canteen of water outside. He approached the woman cautiously, his hand near his Colt. She hadn't moved. She sat with her back against the post, her head held high. He set the plate and canteen on the ground within reach of her bound hands. "Eat," he grunted. She looked at the food, then at him, her expression unreadable. She made no move. Sighing, Caleb turned back toward the house. A movement at the corner of the cabin caught his eye. Elsie and Mary stood there, clutching each other's hands, their bare feet pale in the moonlight. They had disobeyed him. Before he could bark an order, Mary spoke, her tiny voice carrying like a bell in the still night. "Why is she tied up, Pa? She looks sad." "She's a prisoner, Mary. Now get inside." But Elsie, the older, the one who remembered her mother more clearly, took a small step forward. She studied the Apache woman, who now watched the children with a fierce, guarded intensity. The woman's eyes, in the moonlight, were not just black, but deep, holding a universe of stories the girls could not fathom. "Pa," Elsie said, not taking her eyes off the woman. "We've been talking. We need a mother." The words were a knife twist in Caleb's gut. "I know, darlin', but it ain't that simple. She's a lady," Mary piped up, as if this logic were irrefutable. Caleb shook his head, a weary, helpless motion. She's not. Like your ma. She's different. She's the enemy." The word, enemy, seemed too big, too abstract for the moonlit scene. The woman was just a woman, sitting in the dirt, tied up. Elsie took another step, then another, drawn by a compassion that transcended her father's hard lessons. Mary followed, a small shadow. "Girls, stop." Caleb's command was sharp, but it was too late. Elsie reached the plate of food. She slowly knelt, picked up a piece of the salt pork, and held it out toward the woman's mouth, her small arms stretching. Mary, emboldened, crouched and touched the fringe on the woman's deerskin dress, her tiny fingers gentle. "We need a mother," Elsie repeated softly, her offer of food a silent plea. And they reached for the Apache woman in chains. Caleb froze, his blood turning to ice. He expected violence, a snarl, a bite. The woman looked from the offered food to the small, dirty hand on her dress, to the earnest, motherless faces before her. The rigid defiance in her posture seemed to waver, like a heat mirage. Something ancient and instinctive flickered in her dark eyes. Very slowly, with a grace that belied her bound state, she inclined her head and accepted the morsel from Elsie's hand. She did not smile, but the act of acceptance was seismic. Caleb found he could not move, could not speak. The sight of his daughter's offering succor to his captive, and the captive accepting it with a solemn dignity, shattered the simple world he had built from grief and anger. The chains were still on her wrists, but in that moment, they seemed to bind him, not her. A new and fragile rhythm took hold at the Ryder homestead, born of that moonlit moment. Caleb could not bring himself to lock the Apache woman, who he learned was called Sits with Stones, in the root cellar. Nor could he untie her. The compromise was a longer chain from the post that allowed her shelter in the lee of the barn, and a grudging, watchful tolerance of his daughter's quiet fascination. He worked from dawn until dusk, repairing a windmill, writing the fence lines, his body moving on habit while his mind churned. Every time he looked toward the barn, he saw a tableau that confused his soul. Elsie would be sitting a careful few feet away, reading aloud from her mother's tattered book of Psalms, her voice stumbling over the unfamiliar words. Mary would be braiding strands of old rope, her brow furrowed in concentration, mimicking what she imagined was women's work. And Sits with Stones would be listening, or watching, her hands busy stripping a piece of willow he'd cut, her movements economical and sure. She rarely spoke. When she did, it was a low, melodic word or two in her own language, or a heavily accented English command to the girls, back, when they came too close to the chain's limit. Son, pointing to the sky when the heat was at its worst. She accepted the food Caleb brought, and the water, but her eyes held no gratitude, only a patient, waiting assessment. One afternoon, a crisis erupted. Mary, chasing a barn kitten, tripped over a rusty harrow tooth hidden in the grass. The gash on her leg was deep and ugly, welling blood that soaked her stocking. Her screams were piercing, panicked. Caleb came running from the corral, his heart in his throat. He scooped her up, but his big, rough hands fumbled, useless against the flow of blood and her terrified writhing. Elsie, get the linen. The whiskey. He barked, staggering toward the house. A voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the chaos. Put her down. Here. Sits with Stones was on her feet, the chain pulled taut. She pointed to a clean patch of earth in the shade. Her eyes were not on Caleb, but on the sobbing child. You hold. You make worse. Stung, but paralyzed by fear for Mary, Caleb obeyed. He laid Mary on the ground. Elsie ran up with a torn sheet and the bottle of whiskey. Before Caleb could act, Sits with Stones reached out, her chained hands moving with decisive purpose. Give, she said to Elsie. Elsie handed her the linen. Ignoring the whiskey, Sits with Stones examined the wound with a critical eye. Then she did something extraordinary. She reached into a small, hidden pouch at her waist and produced a wad of dried, fragrant leaves. She put them in her mouth, chewed briefly, then spat the poultice into her palm. With her other hand, she plucked a handful of spiderweb from the barn eaves. In one smooth motion, she pressed the herbal mash into the wound and bound it tight with the web and a strip of linen. Mary's cries subsided to whimpers. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Sits with Stones placed a cool hand on the child's forehead and hummed a few notes of a song that was neither a lullaby nor a chant, but something in between. Mary's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing evening out. Caleb stood there, sweat and dust coating his skin, feeling more helpless than he ever had in a fight or a storm. This woman, his enemy, had acted with a competence his own brute strength lacked. She had healed what he could only have made worse. Yarrow and sage, she said, not looking at him, wiping her hands on her dress. Spider web seals. No poison now. That evening, he brought her an extra blanket. He set it down beside her, his usual gruffness absent. For Mary, he muttered. Thank you. She looked at the blanket, then up at him. She is child. The earth hurts all children the same. It was the longest sentence she had spoken to him. Later, through the cabin window, he saw Elsie bring Sits with Stones a battered doll. The woman took it, examined it with a solemnity usually reserved for sacred objects, and placed it carefully beside her. It was not a gesture of play, but one of profound respect for the child's offering. Caleb turned away from the window, the walls of his prejudices feeling thin and insubstantial. The chain was still on her wrist, but every day, every interaction, forged a stronger, more complicated link between this woman and his daughters. And he was no longer sure who, exactly, was the captive. The turning point came with the blue norther. It swept down from the plains without warning, a wall of frigid wind and stinging ice. Caleb had just finished securing the animals in the barn when the first blast hit, stealing his breath. He lunged for the cabin as hail began to drum on the roof like gunfire. Inside, Elsie and Mary huddled by the fire, their faces pale. The wind screamed through every chink in the logs, and the temperature plummeted. Caleb fed the fire, his mind racing. The barn was sturdy, but the lean-to where Sits with Stones was sheltered was exposed. It was a flimsy barrier of wood and canvas against a murderous wind. The chain that bound her to the post would become a death sentence in the flying debris. He saw the fear in his daughter's eyes, but it wasn't for themselves. "Pa," Elsie whispered, her voice trembling. "The lady. She'll freeze." Mary began to cry softly. "Don't let the ice get her, Pa." Caleb stood at the window, watching the canvas rip loose and cartwheel into the blackness. A moral calculation, cold and hard as the hail, settled in his gut. He could leave her. She was a prisoner, a raider. Her death would be convenient, a grim solution. No one would question it. But then he saw not the Apache woman, but the woman who had patiently listened to psalms, who had healed his daughter's leg with herbs and spider silk, who accepted a battered doll as an offering of peace. He saw the woman his children had reached for. Swearing under his breath, he grabbed his heavy coat and a wool blanket. "Stay here," he yelled over the wind's roar and shoved his way out the door. The world was a chaos of white and howling dark. Icy pellets slashed his face. He fought his way to the barn, the wind trying to pry him from the earth. Sits with Stones was pressed against the lee side of the barn, her arms wrapped around herself, the chain pulled taut. She was shivering violently, her dress already stiff with ice. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide, not with fear of the storm, but with shock at his presence. Without a word, Caleb fumbled with the heavy padlock on the chain. His fingers were numb, clumsy. Finally, it sprang open. He pulled the cold, heavy links from around the post. He wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and gripped her arm. "Come on." He half-dragged her through the maelstrom to the cabin, shoving her inside before stumbling in after her and slamming the bolt home against the storm. They stood dripping and gasping in the sudden, relative quiet, the only sound the frantic beating of the storm outside and the crackle of the fire. Elsie and Mary stared, wide-eyed. Sits with Stones stood just inside the door, water pooling at her feet, the blanket around her. She looked at the warm room, the fire, the two girls, then at Caleb. The chain was gone from her wrist, leaving only a raw, red band. She was unchained. In his home. Caleb met her gaze, his own breathing ragged. "Ain't no one dies in my yard," he said, the words a rough justification. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. She let the blanket fall and moved toward the fire, not as an invader, but as a survivor claiming shared ground. She knelt, holding her hands to the flames. Elsie, without hesitation, fetched her own small quilt and draped it over the woman's shoulders. Mary crept forward and leaned her head against Sits with Stones' arm. Caleb watched, the last fortress of his heart surrendering. He had brought home a prisoner, a symbol of his hatred and loss. But his children, with their simple, desperate need, had seen something else. They had seen a woman. And in reaching for her, they had forced him to see her too. Sits with Stones looked at the girls clinging to her, then up at Caleb. Her voice, when it came, was low and clear. "The children have a mother," she said. It was not a question, nor a claim. It was a statement of fact, as solid as the earth, as true as the fire's heat. "I am called Sits with Stones. My children were taken by the fever, 2 winters past. Your chains did not hold me. Theirs do." Caleb sank into a chair by the fire, the weight of 2 years of lonely grief finally crumbling. The storm raged outside, but inside, a fragile, unbreakable peace had been built, not by a man with a gun, but by 2 little girls with open hands. The Apache woman was no longer in chains. She was home.